Good morning and good year. Gemar Chassim Teva to everybody. We're in Ayin Beis, volume 3, on page 1245. And the discussion is, well, first let's just put it in context. It's the highest levels of the maturity and maturation of emotions and the intellect, and how they interact with each other, where initially it is the mind that tames, that trains, that guides and refines and elevates the raw natural emotions. That's where we go mutfa, murgish, muskul. We go from the natural, behavioral, reflexive to more of a developed emotion, to cognitive emotions. And as the mind grows and the emotions grow with it, to the point that the emotions become sublimated and subsumed in intellect itself, meaning not that they become intellect, but they become as pristine, as pure, in a certain way of experiencing something beyond their own subjective nature. In a way like them, you can say the emotions become transcendent. What he called midas sichlim, and bina is one level, and chachma on a higher level, where chachma actually has the power to transform these emotions from their very nature and their natural structure and wiring. And but at the same time, it's chachma and bina working together, and bina too grows to a point, like we learned that bina itself, there's chitzenius bina, as it relates to the emotions, and aim, revetzes ala frechim, the mother that hovers over and protects her offspring, which is bina, protecting and guiding and educating the emotions. And then comes a higher level where now the emotions catapult and elevate the bina back to its very core, what he calls shlach tishlach ha'se'im, that the mother actually is sent away from her children, which in this context means that the mother, the bina, goes back to her original source, where it stands side by side in the same stature with chachma. And that he called a zivuk shalim, a complete union. And that complete union is the ultimate last point that he made on page, just to give you the page numbers, on page 1236, that is required in order to ultimately create what he calls drawing down from the staklus, gazing at the metzach, the forehead of arich, which draws the energy of atik. And then, of course, you have the highest level of experience, but an experience absorbing something beyond the individual, beyond the person's own interests and self, I should say. But now the emotions are also part of the experience, because they are also experiencing it. It's not just you disconnected from the emotions. The emotions have been elevated to this level. So the emotions are affecting bina, after bina affected the emotions, as we discussed. Now, so there's these two levels. And what level does it reach? In Aveda, he called this reaching a level beyond b'chol avavcha, b'chol nafshecha, the level of b'chol meidecha. So we say, v'ahavtas Hashem elekecha, we begin with b'chol avavcha, b'chol nafshecha. He made it clear that both of those levels, though they go progressively higher, are both still containable by the individual. B'chol avavcha means with all your heart. The heart is able to contain it. B'chol nafshecha, it also impacts the faculties, like he said, Rotz l'dvar mitzvah, that the love is also causing the faculties, like a person is running to do a mitzvah. So the very body and the faculties of the person are also consumed with this love. But that too is still within the parameters of the structure of the person. B'chol ma'idecha is an intensity that cannot be contained by the heart and by the faculties. So it's going beyond the very nature of a person's own structure, and that is called b'chol ma'idecha. And that's the level that bina reaches through the midas after the first stage where Bina was protecting and revetzes Allah Frechim, now we're talking about Bina as it goes back to its core place. So he called that Moedecha. However, the question was posed on page 1243 that we have to understand the connection. Bina means hasaga, comprehending, and comprehending has absolutely parameters and structure. And at the same time, b'chol meidech, on the other hand, is bligvul. It means going outside of any bligvul. So yes, indeed, in Zohar, and he brought a few Zohars that all indicate that Bina is connected to b'chol meidech, what he called the level that does not have a shiur. He said b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha is both, they still are within the parameters. But what's the explanation for it? That's the question. Also, does this ava b'chol meidecha so-called nullify the individual to the point they become like a point where it's so overwhelming the person loses their identity? Or is b'chol meidecha an expansive experience where it goes even beyond the love of b'chol nafshecha, b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, and it's far more expansive, as second question that he asked. So to answer that, the Rebbe Rashab went and said that you have to say that in b'chol meidech itself, there are two levels. So in this ava, which is suprarational, beyond the structure of the rational, you have to say there are two levels, an outer and inner dimension. And he compared it to the two levels in koil, in psychos hakoil. So we have voice, a sound that has structure, which is words. So that too can express profound things, words that come from the heart, enter the heart, but it's still defined by a kavanah of seichel and midas. In other words, it's expressing a very defined, intelligently, deliberately conceived and emotional expression. On the other hand, psychos hakol, which means psyche that is not without words, that is just a cry. That expresses something deeper and more from the etzem hanefesh. But in psychos hakol itself, there's two levels. There's one that actually has sound, so it has some form of expression. It's beyond, it's higher than the expression of words, but it's still form of an expression. And he compared that to being ha'ara from the etzem. It's not the etzem itself. And then there's a hatzaikas halev, where there's no sound at all. And that's a far deeper expression. It touches him so deeply that he cannot even express it even in a sound. As he says at the top of page 1245. And now, and further in the next paragraph, he says, these are the two levels in b'chol meidech as well. There's a b'chol meidech that's higher than b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, that is suprarational. Because the first two come from some contemplation. He says, tam b'seichel. So it's not an expression from the core essence of the person's love, of the neshama's love for God. It's coming through a process. Whereas b'chol meidecha, he says, he calls it, I mean, the difference between b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, going back again. One is in the lev itself, and b'chol nafshecha, that it extends in all the faculties, like I mentioned before. Whereas on the other hand, which would be, he compares it to the difference between a river, a regular flow of a river, and when a river reaches the river banks due to extra rain or the melting of snow, so the river extends. So b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, but extends to its parameters, to the banks, doesn't overflow. And then b'chol meidecha is overflow. Ava atzmish shebenefesh ein ze mitzad chiyuv haseichel. This is not due to any contemplation. In other words, it's not born out of a contemplation. You'll need seichel to reveal it. We'll talk about that in a moment, but it's not born out of that. And that's b'chol meidecha. Shanefesh ba'atzmei reitze b'elakus. It's like the natural love of a child to a father, to a parent. V'yesh b'zeh beis madreges. And in b'chol meidecha, like we said with Tzaika, with the cry, as opposed to dibur, speech, there's two levels. The first level we learned about, and that is the intensity of the stimulation, excitement of the nefesh with a deep or strong thirst in order to be encompassed in its source. And that is pilus bizgalus belev. But it's not as galus belev where you feel yourself. It's where you're becoming subsumed and completely, he said, bittul betachlis. Person's losing themselves in this experience. So it's a deep love, but it's a love that so-called nullifies or overwhelms your identity. And it's coming from that closeness, not out of despair or out of minametza distress. And it does not have moichin at all involved in this. It's the natural longing, the natural longing of the soul to godliness. Yeah, thank you. Now, what was the catalyst that caused this love to be aroused? Why isn't that dormant? So there he says, like I said, you could also be right near someone you love deeply and you're not aware of them. So this bonus here is not to create or give birth to emotions, it's to reveal and get them going, so to speak. To spark the pilot flame, that it should be, like fan the pilot flame, that it should be expressed. But the Ratze itself is not due because your mind told you this is worthwhile loving or connecting with. It's your own very natural connection, but the bonus is to reveal it. And he keeps focusing, it's not taruvas hamoichin, which is going to be relevant very much to the second level. The hainu, the b'shas eispilus, ein bezeh mepulas hameichin klal, rak mepulas halev levad, mashalev rotz v'tzome b'yeser. So the mind is not, or doesn't play a role except so-called sparking or awakening, but does not play a role in the actual love and the longing. The ein zeh meisev b'meichin. And it does not increase anything in the moichin. So in a way, it's emotions that are divorced of the intellect, but now we're talking about, of course, very mature emotions. We're not talking about emotions as they are by a child. By a child, the emotions are immature, katnus. Here, the emotions are very much connected to their source, but the moichin are not part of the process, except for what I just said. And also he adds that afterwards in the shuv, after this rotze, this yearning and longing, when a person so-called returns back to themselves, then it will increase something in the moichin as well. But the very emotions are emotional, not cognitive. And therefore he says, and then he says, ha'ava zeis, even though it's in pnimius hanefesh much more than b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, which are a result and outgrowth of intelligence, which means they have structure, like we spoke before about the voice, the sound that has words. Nevertheless, like the sound that has words, and it's higher than that, but nevertheless, like the psychos hakoil, the cry with a voice, it's not atzmis and nefesh, it's only a reflection of the core. So though it's deeper, but it's only a reflection of the atzmis and nefesh, v'hainu b'chitzeni is the arotzna atzmis shebenefesh. So identifies this level of b'chol meidecha, higher than b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, but it's still the outer dimension of the core desire of the nefesh, and that's why it does not completely saturate the person. It's only in the lev. Mokim is gal sarotz no b'pnimius halev. V'arotza had l'mayla maseichel l'cheinu b'lev v'lei b'mayach. So now therefore that we have a higher level, but it's not yet completely united with a person's mind, which he's now going to explain is the higher level of B'chol Moedech. So that's a summary just to catch up, and it was, I think, important because a lot of points to be made here. So for continuing, I thought we should first understand what we learned so far. I should mention, I think I mentioned it already, that all this is built on a mimer called Kan Sipur, which is the nest, the bird's nest, the mitzvah of Shaluach HaKan that he's referring to, the verses that he talks about, the mother protecting and hovering over the chicks and offspring, and then the mother being sent away, is a very fascinating mimer from the Tzemach Tzedek, which apparently is from the Alter Rebbe, but the Tzemach Tzedek elaborates on it in Eira Teire Kiseitze. So a lot of these ideas are straight from there, but a lot more elaboration. It's an interesting comparison, actually. But like often, it's some of it is the language from that mimer, but a lot more is added here than is written there. But you see the basis of it is very clearly there. Very deep mimer, as we see here. And what's also interesting is that the Rebbe Rashab is what he's doing, he's connecting it to, in general, the entire growth of emotions. There, he doesn't go through mutfa, murgish, muskel, but he's here, as an Ayin Beis does constantly, connecting all the Maimorim, all the Hasidic discourses that talk about the growth of the mind and the emotions that we're discussing here. But this is clearly higher levels because we're talking about Bina reaching its core place. Just as that's not an aside, just wanted to point out those sources. Now, we're going to do now, I'll just continue here. Because so far we learned only the first level, which is comparable to the cry that's greater than language and speech, but it's still not the silent cry. It still has sound. So it's still a reflection. And Aveda, it means it affects the emotions, but the mind has not been part of the process directly in the emotional experience. So it's an emotional experience, a very high level emotional experience of like coming home, where a child connects with its parent and feels it in its emotions. Whereas its primary is intellect driving the emotions. Now it's emotions that are sparked and somewhat revealed by intellect, but the intellect is not part of the emotional experience. And now he's going to speak about a higher level where everything is integrated and united in a higher, greater experience. I already gave an introduction to this in the last class, I believe, but now we'll learn it inside. But just in case somebody wants to ask something about what we learned till now, I'll stop for a moment. If anybody wants any clarity about what we've discussed so far. Obviously, we're middle of the subject, but nevertheless, anything? Okay. So now the bottom of page 1245, the new paragraph. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com if you're following along, if you want to follow along with the text. She says, "V'hamadrega habeis." What's the madrega beis? So middle of the page, he said beis madregas in b'chol ma'adecha itself. So madrega aleph he covered in the second half of the paragraph, previous paragraph. Now the madrega beis refers back to that. And what's the second level in b'chol ma'adecha? So he's already set the stage and the tone, so we can get a sense. He's going to say, "He kasher ave he be'emek nekudas hanefesh b'bchinas ava atzmis mamish." So let's first translate that the ava is in the depths of the point of the nefesh. Nekudas hanefesh. I just want to clarify because sometimes we like nekuda means a dot or a spark, like nekudas hachachma. Chachma begins with a flash. But Nakuda also has the meaning very concentrated in one point. Not always just means, it doesn't mean the spark of the heart. It means in the core essence, like when you say, it touched me in the core. The core is the Nakudas HaNefesh. The depth of the Nakudas HaNefesh, the love is piercing and penetrating there. And what type of Ava? It's an Ava Atzmis Mamish. So you'll see the words he's using here, he did not use till now. He called before Ava Atzmis. If you look at the first level of B'chol Meidech, he did say, the Atzmis, I'm just looking at the words. He called it Ha'ara from Atzmis, meaning it's higher than B'chol Avavcha, B'chol Nafshecha, which are manifest in structure and defined by an intelligent cognitive process. But he says ha'ara atzmis. And now he's saying it's atzmis mamish. As I pointed out a number of times, mamish means in context, there could be atzmis, but not literally the full level of atzmis of the core sense, core essence of the person. Shekol atzmuse b'zeh. The entire essence of the person is immersed and involved and subsumed and consumed by this love. Of course, we have to understand what's the difference between this and the first level of B'chol Moedecha. So I would suggest I'll read. Let's see what the Rebbe Rashab says about it, and then we'll elaborate as need be. So he says, "V'yiseder sa'avihi." So I'm learning the pshat now, and the awakening of this love that we're talking this higher level. This does come by delving deeply. The mind is delving deeply into the subject. So you see here both sides of the coin. The Seder Sa'ava is coming through in focusing, concentrating deeply with your mind, Seichel. And then the other side, and the love causes that one should immerse themselves deeply into this experience. So remember we spoke about, that was the issue we were talking about. Does the moichin affect the seichel? Does the seichel affect the emotions, or do the emotions affect the seichel? So first we learned that the mind is affecting the emotions and elevating them and impacting them to their highest levels. But then suddenly it reversed, that al yedei, when he says shlach tishlach hasa'im, he said through the midas, is because of the offspring that you're sending away the mother. It's not just being sent away on its own. In other words, Bina is going back to its core because of the offspring. That means the midas have come to a point where they're, like we learned from Torah Eir, Yafa koyach haben koyach av, that the offspring are catapulting the parent, in this case Bina, to a higher level. So here you see it explicitly, that it's working both directions, which means that the entire human being is involved in the process. The mind is affecting the emotions are affecting the mind to go deeper into the experience. We'll still have to discuss what the mind's role is and what the emotion's role is, but it's clearly that they're both impacting each other. And now to qualify, so right away the question comes up, if that's the case, so how is this different than B'chol Levavcha, B'chol Nafshecha, which we said is rational? B'chol Moedecha, the first level we said was suprarational. He said it's lo yalidei seichel. It's just the so-called like the biological genetic connection between a child and a parent. It's not based on intelligence. The hisbonenus is only to be made you aware that this is your parent or your parent is near you, or just to make you conscious of that love. But the love is not dependent on intelligence. Now you're saying that's coming through moichin, through seichel. So the Rebbe Rashab qualifies and says, "Loi v'loi b'bchinas hasaga." This is not a form of intelligence of comprehension. He doesn't say it explicitly, but it means clearly that he's referring to the hasaga, that the first level where moichin gives birth to an emotion. Ki'im b'bchinas emek shalamaylam hasaga. The focus here is on the word emek, that it's a profound, I would even say resonating intelligence, not just understanding. In other words, chitzeni is bina is taking an akuda of chachma, the spark or flash of a chachma, and elaborating and developing it. And that is lower than chachma. But then there comes a point where bina goes back to its atzmius, because bina's role is essentially to flesh out the idea and also to explain it to the students. So in this case, the mother training its children based on a comprehension. But then there's a level of bina that is more than just understanding something, where it becomes that in the understanding, you're going back to the nekuda of chachma, and it's also experiencing that which is somewhat, we'll say, suprarational, but at least not purely understanding it on your terms. That the resonating truth that chachma provides, bina is also connecting with. So therefore he says it's an emek shalamaylam hasaga. So it's essentially stages in understanding something itself. There's the beginning levels where you're developing the idea, but at the expense of not necessarily having that core truth that chachma provides. And then there's coming to the emek That's Lamayla Mahasogit. Now, thank God, the Rebbe Rashab is going to give an example. And this example is straight from Eira Teira that I mentioned before, from Kiseitse. This example, which probably is most likely the Alter Rebbe's example. It's a unique example. You don't find it very often, but it's used here. And it's taking us, you'll see, to a level far beyond what we've learned till now, where till now we've been learning about natural emotions. Then we learned about intelligence informing the emotions. When you contemplate on something and reach higher levels of godliness that are beyond you. Then we talked about an emotional experience, but there's no moichin in it because the moichin are not involved in the emotional experience, a high level of emotional experience. Now he's going to tell us how the mind and the emotions come together in this experience that's beyond yourself, but all of you is involved in it. Because remember, in the interface that is so central to the theme of Ayin Beis, is you don't want just an experience that's beyond you. You want that beyond to become part of you. So yes, we need to have a stage where we are in awe and we're absorbed by something beyond us, but then we want to also internalize it. And that's where you're going to see how Moichin works hand in hand with emotions on this higher level. We're talking about the highest level of B'chol Meidecha, V'ahavta B'chol Meidecha. So we have the level where emotions are beneath Seichel. We have the level where emotions are guided by Seichel. We have a level where emotions are higher than Seichel. And now we're going to have a level where emotions and Seichel join together in a greater experience. That's the best way to really structure this in a way that makes sense. So he's going to say, Val derech moshel. Here's the example. K'odem hameimik meichi v'liboi u'machshavtei. A person delves. He concentrates, delves deeply, invests his mind, his heart, and his thought. In something that his life is dependent on it. So we're talking about a life situation. We're not talking about just understanding a concept, even a beautiful concept, even a divine concept. His chayiv tluyim boy. Ad hanefesh mamish. So just an example, a person is in danger. There's a dangerous situation. And they can't just react emotionally and say, okay, we got to get out of this crisis. You need to have a plan. Because it's not just like you're running out of a burning building, God forbid. We're talking about a very serious situation, but it's affecting his life itself. It's a negei b'nafshe. I'm not saying he says that. He's talking necessarily life-threatening, but he's clearly saying shechayev tluyim boy. His life is dependent on it. So how will the mind suddenly, what kind of mode will it go into? So when you're learning, let's say a hemshech Ayin Beis, or you're learning any idea in Chassidus or in Torah, or lahavla, or in any wisdom, any school of thought, obviously you invest your mind, and if you're especially very passionate, you're going to really focus and concentrate. But it's a completely different qualitative level when it's something that's negei b'nefesh, something that's touching your very life. Then your mind is going to go into overdrive and focus and concentrate on a completely different level because the stakes and the consequences are life and death. So he's saying that the seichel itself is going to a very different mode when something is so deeply connected to it. What basically is going to lead to that there's an ava of Hashem where you love God because you value it, you're passionate about it, you're excited, everything we learned about. But it's not, you can't say it's your etzem hanefesh mamish because you don't have this level, that it's the gei b'nefesh. And in other words, you're so desperate you can't live without it. Or it's literally a matter of your own very existence. So that's the mashal he says. I'll read it again. A person who inserts himself, invests, concentrates, delves with his mind, heart, and thought in something something that his life is dependent on it. And it affects and it touches all the way to the core of the person himself, the soul itself. Dehine is going to explain further, because now his pilus pnimi gam bedover and negei b'nefesh mamish hu idea das v'aseichel dafke. He's going to make a case why you need the mind involved, Because you could argue, when a person is in that state of an emergency, or a state where his mamish, his life is dependent on it, maybe he's completely going into an emotional state. So he says, no. His pilus panimi, gam bedover negei benefesh mamish. When a person has that inner, I'm looking for the right word. It doesn't mean excitement, the inner stimulation. He's aroused to the point, even in a thing, also in a thing that's negei benefesh. He says, "Hu alidei hadas v'seichel dafke." This is coming specifically through das and seichel. Now, what does it mean? Why das and seichel? Isn't emotions? You feel an emotion. You feel, let's say, you're afraid of something, or you're very much drawn to something because you're very much dependent on it. So he says the kasher sheispilus hamidus b'chlal hu das. Because in general, all midas, the spilus of midas, is through das. Now you may recall, he explained this a while back when he spoke about v'yadaita hayoim. I think it was in volume 2, at the end of volume 2, that das is the chachma bina das. Chachma bina are the two, the father and the mother. But like he says in Tanya, at the end of chapter 3, what's das? Is the iskashus. If you don't personalize it, chachma bina is not going to give birth. So das is compared to intimacy, where Abba ve'ima, Chachma bina, become intimately connected to whatever it is it's contemplating on, which is das, and that ultimately gives birth. Now, there are emotions that don't require Chachma bina and das. As I said, hardwire emotions that a person has within them, like a child, a newborn child has feelings. And they're not guided by Chachma Bina Das, at least not in a revealed way. But here he's talking about, obviously, a mature adult who's sensing that his life is dependent on it. So he says, because Das is Hergish Hadover, that you feel the very idea, you feel it in a personal way, like we talked the story with the analogy Chassidim, the example Chassidim give to explain das. That's the dain tate. Just to remind you that a person in the olden days, not everybody was literate and they couldn't read. So a letter arrived with the sad news that somebody's father had passed away. God forbid. But he couldn't read the letter. So he hired someone to read the letter for him. And he's reading. As they come to that part of the letter, the child, the son, whose father had passed, faints. The person reading it continues reading. So the obvious question is, what do you mean? He's reading it. He understands what it says there better than, and read it before the son did. But it's not his father. So it's not negay to him. It's not negay benefesh. Doesn't have any hergish in it. He's technically reading it. He's just a reader. So das adds to seichel, that the seichel is not just an idea, but it's negay benefesh to you. The hergish adov, it's yours. It's your father. That creates a hergish in seichel, which in turn will create the emotion that caused the son to faint. So the way that the ispilus primi, and also in a thing that's negay benefesh, even though of course it's an emotional experience, but it's originating with a hakara recognition. There's an expression, sheita ena margish. A fool does not feel things. What's a connection? Well, people feel if you put your hand in fire, God forbid, even a fool is going to be burned. But that's reflexive. We're talking about to appreciate something in a profound way. So das is the role that's negeya, that helps a person come to their mind, a bond, and become intimate and personalize whatever it is they're learning, which he calls hergish hadover. And that's Bechlal his Pilus Hamidus. Shahari Yeshmi, I'll continue reading. Let me just see 1 second. Shari Yeshmi, next page, 1246. Shemispol, Yesh She'enim Mispol. There's an individual that does get excited or aroused or stimulated, and there's one that doesn't. Ukomoshin is barely ill. like we learned earlier, this I believe is referring to the volume 2 that I just described about Das. Ukamashikosov, as it's written, Ba'abiyur, this is a mimer probably from the Alter Rebbe in Likutei Torah in Veschanon, in the explanation of the mimer of the Pasuk V'Yadaita Hayoim. So in Likutei Torah, there's a Maimorim V'Yadaita Hayoim, which is the verse that we've been learning through the last quite a few hundred pages. V'Yadaita Hayoim V'Shavesa Levavecha. So V'Yadaita is Das, no. V'Shavesa Levavecha is draw it and carry it to your heart. So there he explained that there are situations a person can be excited and not be excited. So now he's bringing it back. So just as it is in emotions in general, so the same is with the law of the ava atzmis, the core love, shemitzad etzma nefesh, that's coming from the very core of the soul, that's connected to the divine, to Elokus, shetoli gamkin ba'amokas hadas. That too is dependent on how much you delve into it in depth, and how much you feel and sense it. So in other words, before we said that there's the natural love and all you need is a contemplation to be aware. Like a child, let's say, doesn't know they're in the presence of the parent, or they're not thinking about it. So you need the kind of mind to make you aware that that your parent is here and appreciate it, and that draws forth a love. Now he's saying there's more to it than that. That love could also be, even though it is the core love of child to a parent, but it's not atzmis mamish, because that's dependent on being more delving into it in a full sense of the word, where you have your das is concentrating on it. That's what he's adding now. So it's not just that core love, it's also dependent on how much you're really deeply feeling it. And that's dependent on das, hainu b'hergesh hadover. So he's going to use this example of father and child, parent and child. Ukamoy ba'ava atzmis the ava ben. Like the core love of a father and a child. This could also be a mother. Av here, even though he uses the word av, but it means a parent. So a parent and a child, a father and a child. On Uroyim bechush, we actually see sheyachal liyas shelo yispol gam b'davar nafshi mamish. It's possible that a person should not get nispol, excited, even davar nafshi mamish, even something that's very negate to the nefesh, something that's negate to life. Kumei beheder Rahman al-Islam. I'm not sure what he means by heder Rahman al-Islam. Does he mean heder achaim or heder? I'll go back to this line in a moment. Let me just see what he said. Let's read further. This is only due to the fact that he's not feeling it. In other words, you could have a situation. I have to look in this. I want to look in the Eira Teira how he explains it. But it sounds to me that he's talking about that a child, for example, could hear that their parent is in danger and their life is in danger. So you would think the natural instinct of a child is to go do something about it. But you see, unfortunately, there are people who don't get that excited about it. They're detached. That doesn't mean there's no core love. It means that they're not concentrating on it. They're not thinking about it, or they got distracted. People get estranged from their parents, or some other thing that's blocking them. So what he's saying here, that you could see that a person lo yispol, and that's only due because heder hahergesh, because he's not feeling it, not because it's not, that connection's not there. Shahari ha'ava atzmis yeshna be'etzem, because the core love is there fundamentally. That you cannot change. You cannot change that core love. The only thing that's happening, it's not revealed because the lack of das, the lack of concentration. Let's say a person is very distracted. I mean, unfortunately, I've seen this, where a person is very involved in something that can be completely nonsense, frankly, and they hear about something that affects their parents, and they send someone else to go take care of it. Now, it doesn't mean their love is not there. It means that they're not focusing. They really understood what the gravity of what was going on, and the das, and not be distracted, they would absolutely act as if it's an emergency situation. He's not feeling it in the sense like it's mine. Let's continue, because he's not finished. However, kasher al pi harev. This is a minority. This is an exception. It's not the rule. Kasher al pi harev. Generally, the rule is al pi harev, the majority. In other words, in most cases, hari mispola odem bedavar atzmi. A person does get excited about something that's an atzmi. We're talking not a superficial, surface level connection, something that's affecting your very core. Yesh b'zeh hefresh. When a person does get excited, is yesh b'zeh hefresh imay spalus berash ubizgalus. So there too, there's two levels. One is that the spalus is berash ubizgalus. It could be a stimulation, an excitability. That's not rash means noise, but rash means it's loud, it's expressed, ubizgalus, and revealed. Gedela bizgalus gedela shemispol b'yeser. So let's talk about a scenario. Okay, the same thing, something about your parent, someone's parent, and they absolutely get affected by it, and they get all worked up and emotional. Bizgalus gedela shemispol b'yeser. Very excited about it, very stimulated. I mean, excited, I don't mean excited in a positive way. I mean to say that it's affecting him in a very direct way. And that excitability is only due, not because the core is there no matter what, but this is due to this galus of the ava atzmis. Because now it's revealed, the person is quite aware of their core connection. So therefore they're not, like the first case scenario, which he said was an exception, where a person is somewhat detached or somewhat aloof or disconnected. But nevertheless, that's level one. Even though now we're talking about someone who is touched and affected, but he's not misbattle, he's not nullified, he's not sublimated. The etzem mitziyuse. His very core identity has not been overwhelmed, so to speak. Gam b'shasei spilus. Even during this moment when he's so spilus, is so stimulated and aroused, shuba mitzias means that he remains in his mitzias, in his personality. V'chein achakach, and so too afterwards, meaning after that moment of excitement passes, he remains who he is. And now he's going to say, and here's the higher level. Umishu b'meichen de gadlus. And a person who's a meichen de gadlus, meaning a mature mind, and it's more than mature. Meichen de gadlus means an expansive, a person who's on the highest level of concentration. V'chol dover hu b'hamokas hadas. And by him, there's no such thing as superficial anything. Everything comes with concentrated immersion. And that causes that by him, he has even a deeper feeling. It's not expressive, but it's far deeper qualitatively because it's a person who's very deliberate and has that level of intelligence and the level of meichen de gadlus. You will not see this excitement in a apparent and loud and revealed way. His stimulation, his arousal is going to be an internal and on a core level, the yeser, increasingly so. And his very core is completely shaken by it. That his spirit and his heart internally is completely broken. Kolatz Muse. Well, it doesn't say completely broken. He says, that his spirit and his heart are broken, literally broken within him, internally. But you don't necessarily see it externally. All this is happening on a very internal level. And it's not possible. It doesn't relate to anything that expands itself, extends itself, and reveals itself at all.
But misbatel kol atzmusai.
Yeah. So two things are happening here. On one hand, the person who is more expressive is also being affected. He basically gave three scenarios here. Something that's negay benefesh. We're talking about something fundamentally connected. We're not talking about a detached experience. It's negay. So you have a person, an exception, unfortunately, that is for whatever reason is. I think that's what he means. Heder Rahman al-Islam. Maybe heder means death. Even, I'm not sure. Anyway, that's coming because he's not feeling it. So therefore, he doesn't get excited. Then there's a level where you do feel and get excited. It's very revealed, very expressed. So you would think that's very powerful. He says, no, that's not mamish, etzem nefesh mamish. And it also doesn't cause you to completely be transformed. It's more of an expression of yours. The real hazoza, the real transformation, the real mizbatum mitziyusi, as he puts it, where you completely lose yourself, is by a person where the whole thing is very internal. So the irony is that the more expressive it is, the less it's really at the core level, which we learned. Remember, tzaikas hakol and tzaikas halev. Someone who cries out for externally, it sounds more passionate, but the real experience is the one that comes so internally that there's not even a sound. So here too, there's no expression at all, but at the same time, it's actually completely, his whole spirit and his heart are broken internally. And so is it with every matter. When he gets excited, only due because that's his natural connection. Hatva means that's how he's wired. If it's coming only due to the natural, what he's talking now is the B'chol Moedecha, the first level. There we said that it's not B'chol Avavcha B'chol Nafshecha. It's coming from the Etzem HaNefesh. But it's coming only due to the fact that you and you're connected to your parent. So he says, nevertheless, so that even though it's coming from Atva, so even though he's excited internally, at the end of the day, it's only an external part of your core. Like he said before, the chitzenius of the etzem, the ha'ara of the etzem. But that person who delves with his whole mind in it, and we're talking about das, skashrus, that you're really connecting within its deepest level, that is in the inner, not the outer dimension of the core, the inner dimension of the core. So we're talking about the core experience. We're not talking about an outside experience. We're not talking about b'chol avavcha, b'chol nafshecha, where your mind gives birth to an emotion that makes sense to be connected to God. Now we're talking about a parent and a child. There is a fundamental core connection. But if it's only coming from the natural connection, it'll be expressive, but it won't be the core itself. It'll be the outer dimension, the reflection of the core. Whereas if it's with Amokas Hadas, it will actually be Primis Atzmis Mamish, Vasimen Alzeh. And here is the siman. Siman is a sign, a litmus test. How do we, an indicator. The Kasheru B'chitzeni is Bilvad, when it's only on the outer level, it comes in the form of expression and extension and reveal. The Einim is Batel Mitzvusei. That itself is an indicator that it's not coming from the very pneumius of the core. He's not in his Batel Mitzvusei. He doesn't lose himself entirely. Yes, he cries, he screams, he yells. Let's say, God forbid, the passing of a parent. So he will definitely feel it and express it, but he's not mizbat l'mitziyusei. Ukasher b'chinas pnimis harizeh b'chashoi, Whereas with someone who's coming with the Hamokas Hadas is coming from a very internal place, it's silent, bli is galus klal, without any revelation, revealing at all. It's not expressed. And he completely loses himself, that he becomes like a nakuda levad, like only a point. There's no expressive identity. Like we said before, aziris, what he spoke about when he says that a person, the love, the from the Zoyar, aziris garmei, becomes like literally like curled up into loses his whole identity.
Which is the one that faints? Which is the one that faints? The second or the third?
Faints could be the second, not the third necessarily. I'm going to explain in a moment. Let me just finish two more lines. And this hamoka requires seichel, requires concentration, requires a person who really appreciates. By delving his mind and his thought in the matter, he becomes mispol, affected in the core of his, in the core essence of his heart, in a type of impact, internal and core level. Now, obviously, to appreciate this, you have to find examples. You know, so the first point we have to realize is this. We generally are external people. So when we see someone crying and someone being unemotional, our first reaction is going to be that the one that's crying is more affected than the one that's not emotional. But he made it clear here that being not emotional could be for two reasons. One is because you don't feel it all together, like he said, person who's just in a state of detachment. Then there's an expressive feeling of sadness, in this case, where you see someone crying. And then there's a deeper level that's also not apparent to the naked eye, but it's coming from the opposite, from the deepest level of the person, that they're so affected that there's no expression at all. But on the other hand, that person is completely impacted by it. You know, the Rebbe always comes to mind when it comes to things like this, because there were times where the Rebbe experienced very profound sadness, the loss of the Rebbetzin, sure, the loss of the Frierdiker Rebbe. And yet there were times that you did not see emotion, but you could see, if you look closely, you could saw in a way like almost shattered. Not talking about out of weakness, but something that completely takes over the person. He's talking about the difference between someone who cries or is emotional about something that touches their core, but they're not a developed mind. So it's obvious that they're going to be affected. Another person who has the ability to control emotions does not mean he's not emotional. It just means the emotions are far deeper and in many ways far more transformative. They completely change the person in the deepest possible way. But like in all things like this, the deeper it is, the less expressive it is. Like we learned before with Psychos HaKoil. They can't even cry out. When he talked on the top of page 1245, he can't even cry out at all. So what I see here are 1, 2, 4, 3, 5 levels. The first is actually 6 levels. V'ahavta b'chol levavcha is you contemplate something about godliness, and it causes your heart to well up in love toward God. But it's not based on a core connection. It's based on something God did for you, a miracle. He's sustaining you. B'chol nafshecha, it goes further. It actually affects all your faculties. Then b'chol moedecha, level 1, is that it goes beyond your faculties, but it's based on your natural connection, like a parent and a child. But there's nothing deeper than that. It's the natural connection. So it's greater than the love that comes based on seichel, which expresses itself in speech or in a particular defined emotion. Now it's an emotion that is beyond, because it's the very core of who we are, but it's on a very basic level. Actually, that would be, I said 5, I think 4 levels. That sounds to me like the first level of the person who does get excited and emotional in this first level. And then you have the highest level where the excitement and the emotional is so deep that you don't see impact, you don't see it, it's not expressed, but it's on the deepest level and it's transformative. It completely changes the person. Then you have the other level, which was in something that's a core connection, and you don't feel it. That's obviously a negative. But nevertheless, if we're going to count the levels,
That's
that
not
clearly,
B'chol Moedecha.
no, of course not. That's not B'chol Meidecha. No, it's not B'chol Meidecha. It's just in the levels of, let's call it possibilities, scenarios. So yes, I would not say therefore not 4 levels in it. It's B'chol Levavcha, B'chol Nafshecha, and 2 levels of B'chol Meidecha. And then there's a scenario where you have a core connection, but you're not feeling it. Then there's where you feel it and it's expressive. That's the first level of B'chol Meidecha. And then there's a level where you feel it even at the core, and it's not expressive, but it's also completely changes the person, completely overwhelms them. Like he says, Mizbatel Mikom Mitziyusei. When the Rebbetzin passed away, and they say the same thing with the Tzemach Tzedek, you saw the Rebbe fundamentally changed. After that, he changed all the Farbrengens, everything changed. So even though actually we did see some expression of emotion, but the deepest expressions were seen more in the changes that happened. No more Maimorim, no more Rashi, no more Zohar, no more Pirkei Avos, no more Rambam. All the things that the Rebbe himself initiated. Now, I'm not going to go into explaining why it expressed itself there, but clearly there was something at the core level that shifted inside the Rebbe. And they say that Tzemach Tzedek, when his Rebbetzin passed away, also Chaim Mushka, there was a fundamental shift that was not apparent. It wasn't like you see him crying all day or just being completely emotional, but a fundamental shift on a very deep internal level. Look, you see this when you see people who are great people and they suffer something greatly. The pain is not in the emotions they express. It's just you see a certain deeper sadness that you know is touching on a much deeper level. Now, this is not taking away from people's expression of sadness. You know, it's a normal thing to cry and to express feelings. He's just discussing it on these levels. And I think the example in the Gei Ben Nefesh is a very powerful example, because 2 people who are, let's say, threatened, their life is threatened, and one person is on a high caliber level and really understands the consequences of this threat, and the other person is more emotional about it, more like in crisis mode. You tell me, who's going to make a better plan in dealing with it? The one that has more hamokas hadas, because he is able, besides just having composure, but he's able to use his mind to deal with it. Even though I know it seems to contradict what it says here, that his whole being is taken by it. But remember, like he said, the hamokas hadas, well, the seichel causes the love, or causes the emotions, and the emotions cause the person to concentrate more. So what's happening here is that the mind, and here's how I would explain it, the mind has something that the emotions don't have on their own. The mind, just like we spoke earlier, that the mind can take a person to another reality that's beyond their subjectivity, here too, even though the emotions here are suprarational, because it's the love of parent and child, it's not based on seichel, but still when it's hatva, like he said, since it's natural, it still has something that is subjective in a certain way. Whereas the mind that focuses and is able to take the experience beyond your own natural thing and go deeper, and that will cause the effect on the person far deeper than the person that's just reacting based on their natural reactions. Like, for example, let's say somebody loses a family member, God forbid. So the person who's on the chetzenius of the etzem, they will experience deep trauma and sadness, but in some ways it may pass after a while. The person who experiences on hamokas hadas level doesn't pass so quickly. That maybe the emotion itself passes, but the effect of it will change them forever in a certain way. He doesn't say that here explicitly. I'm just elaborating a bit on it, just to get more of a sense of what kind of experience this is. So this is the higher level of B'chol Moedech. Okay. So I'm going to stop here.
Question?
Yeah. Now I'm going to stop here. And I'm going to ask if anybody wants clarification for anything. Just 1 second. Let me just see something. I'll just say one more thing, something I've said last class, and I'll say it again. In general, it comes down to this. The deeper the experience, the more intimate it is, the less expression there is. That's why we don't have words, and we can't even cry out when it's the most deepest experience, like shock. On the other hand, even a deep emotional experience that can be expressed, it means it's already on a level outside of the very core. More oiris, less kalim. More kalim, less oir. And the same is an emotional expression. So this is about the deepest levels, of course, in connecting to Elokus. Because ultimately the goal here is Ava. Even though he's giving examples of life situations, but Ava is the ultimate expression. Okay. Any questions?
I have a question at the beginning of this parak, where he's outlining his point before he goes into detail. In the third line, Nesa hasecha b'yoser, and then he prepared parakol v'lo b'chinas hasaga ki'im b'chinas omek shelamayla min hasaga. So is this saying that this most core level is prompted by the sechel, but it's once it's activated, it itself is above understanding? Because you're saying das is really important, which is mochin, to get to this level, but above, in the beginning, introduction of this concept, he says it's above hasaga.
Hasaga is not das. Hasaga is bina.
But he's still saying it's above intellect.
Let's use the example. He gave a good example. Something that is life-threatening or something that's negei b'nefesh mamish, situation that is not just a abstract concept, it's affecting a person's very matter of life and death, that's negei ada nefesh mamish. So discuss it in that example. So a person with hamokas hadas, he's saying, is going to have far more deeper experience of this negei b'nefesh than someone that does not have hamokas. So let's say a parent and a child. The child will react, we're not talking about the exception, will react emotionally, but the more mature the person is and the more their mind is expansive and the das, that experience will be a far deeper one to the point of non-expression.
My question is about the last part. Shalomayla mehasaga. It's above understanding.
So I explained at length. Hasaga is chitzeni is bina, where you have chachma, and then you develop an idea. It's not about oimek. It's about understanding something. And the oimek is when you're delving deeply with das into an experience that's beyond just a comprehension of, let's say, a mathematical formula.
I see. Okay, thank you.
The hamokas haseichel b'yeser is triggered by the fact that it's negei b'nefesh. Yeah. I mean, he didn't use this example, but when you say sheita eina margish, it means something can really affect a person very deeply. But if he's a sheita and his seichel, his das is not there, he won't fully appreciate or understand the gravity of what's happening. So even though it is a core connection thing, but a person who really fully has das, that mature personalization and intimate connection, is going to have a far deeper experience. Even though it could be two children of the same father, and one person doesn't really get what's happening and the other does, that's the difference. So both of them are affected at their core, but one is going to be much different than the other experience.
So it's an emotional experience, but it's enhanced or it's prompted by mochin and specifically das. Is that fair to say?
If you look at the second line in the paragraph, he says, Hiserus ha'ava hi al dei hamokas ha'seichel, v'al dei ha'ava nasa hamokas ha'seichel b'yeser. So really, they feed each other. So in this case, we're talking about the neshama has a core connection with God, b'chol moedecha, but b'chol moedecha could just be that core connection, and it's not really have hamokas ha'seichel. You're just loving your God because He's one with you. Then the seichel actually causes that love to become far more stimulated, and vice versa. The love causes the person to delve deeper into it because it's negated to them. In other words, for example, if I were to ask somebody, go ahead and do give me an analysis of someone else's father, you're not going to do it with the same passion as if you do an analysis of your own father. I don't mean analysis as in a psychological. I mean to say just to delve in. Whenever something's negay benefesh, your mind is going to become a lot more important. When something's dangerous, you're going to do a lot more research, and your mind is going to become very active because you really need to figure it out. When it's not so negay benefesh, not so important to you, then you're not going to do so much delving into. So you see how, on one hand, that core connection causes the das to work more, or the hamokas haseichel, and the hamokas haseichel in turn feeds and develops that emotion to be a lot deeper one.
That's very helpful. Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you. That was a great
goes both directions. Yeah.
Thank you.
This is so fascinating how Hashem planned it in the human being. He's also saying that hamokas haseichel is not b'bchinas hasoge, but it is oimek shelamayla ma'asoge. It's not regular seichel.
Yeah, because it most likely because it's das. He doesn't use the word das yet there, but he does use it in the next line. Because the difference between das and chachma and bina, chachma and bina is the intelligence itself. It's the idea. Chachma is the spark of the idea. Bina is the comprehension of it. Oimek is connected to something that goes beyond. The idea is connected to you. It's like a deep connection between you and the idea. So the idea becomes much more part of you. It's like, just to use an example, it's like if someone asked you to, as I said, analyze something, evaluate something, and you do a good job. And then the next day they tell you, by the way, what you just evaluated is about you yourself. What's going to happen? Your hamoka is going to become far more intense because now you know it wasn't just an abstract theory. Negate to your life. That type of thing. So it affects, the mind is affected. On the other hand, the hamoka appreciates the experience a lot more because it's really getting into it. That's what it sounds like to me as the b'chinas emek shelamayla ma'hasaga. In other words, that level of das. Now, you could also say emek means not understanding it alone, but also appreciating the so-called quality of the idea. It could also mean that, but it's not a contradiction because that's what.
It's not a contradiction. No. I know how.
No, because remember, when I taught this before, I contrasted it with b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha. That is hasaga. That's mamish hasaga. If you look at the top of the paragraph, the earlier paragraph on page 1245, he says they come from tam v'seichel, not ava atzmis, nachiva seichel, which means there's a hasaga. Let me just see. I think he even uses the word hasaga somewhere. Because there, the whole thing is coming from hasaga. If you don't have hasaga and understanding, you're not going to have the love. The love of parent and child doesn't need understanding. It just needs awareness. So you need the mind to be aware that this is your parent. So the love is then around. The natural inherent love is revealed. Whereas now we're not talking about the hasag, understanding something that leads you to an emotion. You're talking about now an emek, which is the emek in the core connection that you have. Seichel makes it far greater. Maybe I'll add one more thing I think would be helpful. When the Alter Rebbe was teaching Chabad Chassidus, so there were those that had complaints that said Chabad, the seichel is weakening the pure amuna pshuta, the natural amuna and mesiras nefesh that the Baal Shem Tov was teaching. Because built till the Baal Shem Tov, there were many scholars, but we didn't appreciate the core etzem haneshama of even a ish pashut. Like, for example, the famous story Rosh Hashanah, the farm boy that cries out kukuriku. Before the Baal Shem Tov, that child would be dismissed. What are you coming into a synagogue and crying kukuriku? Just to use that as an example. Baal Shem Tov taught, no, but it's coming from his etzem hanefesh. It's not the cookie. He's not trying to be irreverent. He doesn't know how to read Hebrew. He's coming from the deepest part of his neshama. So the complaint, the argument was, the Alter Rebbe, by bringing it into Chabad, he's bringing it back into a structured seichel. And we're going to lose the spark of that amuna pshuta that every man, woman, and child has, just the core love they have for God, whether they're literate or not literate. The mistake they made, that the Alter Rebbe was not coming to take and weaken the mesiras nefesh of etzem haneshama through Chabad. He was coming to internalize it. He's saying that etzem haneshama of the kukuriku, imagine if you can combine that sincerity with someone that knows Hebrew and knows how to read the prayer. So that he reveals the etzem. But now we want to make sure that the seichel, which defines the human being so much, our structure, should also appreciate it. It shouldn't just be coming from the core soul and is compartmentalized in many ways, divorced of our keiches pnimim, our internal faculties, our b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafscha, b'chol meidecha. We're talking here b'chol meidecha, but you get the idea. So the Alter Rebbe, what he's saying here is that you want a combination of etzem, which is the core b'chol meidecha, but not just based on a core. You want to make sure that the person's internalizing it through chachma bina and primarily das, which creates the intimacy. So you're experiencing something beyond the rational, but it's now internalized through your chachma bina das. So the Alter Rebbe wasn't compromising, God forbid. On the contrary, he was internalizing and making sure the experience is a lot deeper than mesiras nefesh and etzem haneshama alone. And interestingly, it actually causes to be not just deeper, it actually transforms you much more because it's so internal. So in a way, if a person who has the passion of the kukuriku and the seichel of Chassidus and the Torah, they may not cry out as loud. You won't see it, but their transformation will be far deeper. So that may be another way of explaining this piece.
Maybe
Very
it
helpful.
was connected to the two levels in the Ava, the amuna pshuta von Ish Pasha, the chitzenius, and
Yeah,
this is
For
higher.
sure. Yeah, I would say that, yes. When I say chitzenius, I mean it's chitzenius of etzem, but it doesn't have the amokas hadas. That's, he says that clearly.
Yeah.
In other words, Chabad actually brings out deeper etzem hanefesh than without Chabad. That's basically what's going on here. And in context of mutva murgish muskel, what you have here is a fascinating level. You see what's happened here. We began with immature emotions, behavioral, natural, wired emotions of a mutva. We moved to emotions. We moved to emotions being guided and trained and tamed and refined by seichel, cognitive emotions. Then cognitive bina, chitzenius hamoichin, pnimis hamoichin, chachma, that takes us to another level and transforms. Bina on both levels that affect the emotions and how Bina goes back to its source with Chachma, receiving, remember, from the Metzach of Arich, because that's suprarational, super consciousness, all the way from Atik. But now the emotions are also part of it because you also brought the natural emotions that even the child had have now become so mature that they're being subsumed with the Moichin into a whole different experience. So it's the core of who you are, experiencing something completely beyond who you are, which is the ultimate combination of subjectivity and objectivity. That's how I would also phrase the whole process here.
Is this related to Shiluach Hakan and where Bina is elevating Chachma? Or that's rather the emotions where Midos are elevating Mochin?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
But he's going to come back. I believe he's going to come back to that as well. Okay. So went a little longer. Let's stop here. I stopped at the end of the paragraph.